Welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo, and with me once again is the great Dr. Grant Harward. For those of you unfamiliar with Grant, please check our recent episode on von Manstein and Dumitrescu. And I invited Grant back today, so we're going to talk about one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. What battle is that, Grant?
The Battle of Stalingrad.
Yeah. Before we get into that, Grant has a fantastic book out. It's called Romania's Holy War, which you can find on Amazon. And briefly, what is that book about, Grant?
So basically, it's looking at the motivation of Romanian soldiers, both in combat and committing atrocity. And, kind of simply put, it's this idea, there's this idea out there the Romanian soldiers just weren't that motivated because they weren't that interested. They didn't know what they were fighting for. A bunch of simple peasants, kind of forced into this whole thing. And my research basically takes an opposite argument that, in fact, they were fighting for a lot of things and not just regaining some territory that had been lost.
Well, we're going to come back to the Romanians here in a little bit.
I do need to say also, I work for the U.S. Army Center of Military History, so I have to put a little disclaimer that what we're talking about today are my own views. They are not the official position of the United States Army or Department of Defense or federal government about the Battle of Stalingrad.
Okay. The Battle of Stalingrad is usually mentioned as the turning point in the European theater of World War II. Can you tell us kind of how we got to this point in the war? Like, I know it's hard to sum up, but everything leading to this point?
Well, I mean, it gets to the point that this is the biggest front of the war. That's kind of the argument for that. And this becomes the biggest front of the war because the Germans win in the West, defeat France, expel the British, but then they have a problem with having Britain surrender and kind of finishing off the war. And then kind of Hitler's weird kind of logic. But the best option was then to attack in the east, knock out the Soviet Union, which had been cooperating with Nazi Germany. And because he was thinking that if I destroy this last major big continental threat, that will then finally force the British to make peace and recognize German hegemony over Europe. And so then you have Operation Barbarossa that's launched in June of 1941 in this attempt to have a campaign that lasts a couple months that would destroy Soviet power, kick in the door the whole rotten edifice, as Hitler thought of it, as said, would just collapse, and you would have this huge giant kind of global defining victory that would then cow the British into kind of deposing Churchill in putting someone in power who would make peace with Hitler, and that doesn't go that way.
Yeah, that's strange logic right there.
Instead, you have a huge campaign that has to be relaunched, right? Operation Typhoon in October of 41. But then, to try to to grab Moscow, finish off the Soviets. But you have a huge winter counteroffensive that, pushes back the German army. So you have the Germans in this campaign lose kind of over 300,000 killed, not counting also wounded and sick and all that. And, this is kind of twice all previous campaigns up to that point. You have an invasion force of 3 million in 1941 that has now been reduced to about 2.5 million. And out of 162 divisions, only about 8 are rated fully capable as they begin the new campaigning season.
Yeah, the Battle of Stalingrad lasted from July 17th, 1942 to February 2nd, 1943, making it one of the longest and bloodiest battles in history. Why was it particularly brutal in a campaign that was already brutal? Why did it stand out?
I think, part of this is just the scale of the Eastern Front, right? It's just a gigantic campaign. And, you have the two regimes that are locked in a kind of total conflict. Both of these totalitarian regimes, very ideological. The Nazis are fighting. They've taken off the gloves. They put out what were called the criminal orders. So it's incredibly bloody. This Battle of Stalingrad, but in some ways it's kind of mythologized. The entire Eastern Front. The Battle of Kiev was extremely bloody, in 41, or Battle of Moscow. In some ways, but I think the big part of this is with the losses suffered by both sides, where the Germans in 41 were able to mostly give out and then kind of take it on the chin a little bit in the winter. In this period, you have the Germans, giving it out, but then also losing an entire field army. And this is going to be what makes it, and also these allied armies that they've had to call on in order to make this whole project even kind of thinkable. I mean, because of that loss in combat power, they had to turn back to allies, especially Romania, Hungary, Italy, to be able to launch this. And you have these armies just get destroyed, and that's going to be this, adding to this myth of, Stalingrad is the bloodiest, most difficult battle of the war.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Leningrad was awful. Siege of Leningrad, and Moscow was terrible. So, yeah, the German offensive was part of, as you mentioned, the Stalingrad German offensive is kind of a follow-up to the Operation Barbarossa campaign, and it's aimed at seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus and cutting Soviet transport along the Volga River. So what was Hitler's plan and what was Stalin's plan?
Yeah, so I mean, this goes to what are the options, that you have kind of three big army groups. You can go north with Army Group North, try to take Leningrad all the way, which is being starved. Well, the Finns aren't going to help. They've already kind of proven that in 41. So that means, all right, we can go in the center and go straight for Moscow again. They're very close still, but at the same time, this is what the Soviets are expecting, which means the Germans look to the south. They're saying, the Soviets aren't as prepared here. They aren't expecting us to go there. The Soviets also don't realize how degraded, Stalin's, as he's making this, they think that they can attack probably on two of these three fronts where the Germans can't, but, the Soviets don't know that. But so the Germans decide that we're going to go in the south. And part of that, I think, also is the Allies, which I mentioned. Romania is in the south, and as well as Hungary, which, they provide their troops along that southern axis. Italy is basing its forces for this attack in Romania. Romania is kind of like its rear echelon base for the Italian army in Russia. And Italy had been kind of pushing to give more than, it had given a corps in 1941 and had been offering to do more. And so the Hitler knows that he can get more forces. Romania had provided a lot of troops in 41, and they knew that they asked and knew that the Romanians would do that again in 42. And the Hungarians, being in competition with the Romanians, could kind of be cajoled into providing a lot of more forces in 42. So you have this idea, like, we're going to go in the south. We got these allies that will provide troops. I also think you have the Black Sea down there, which is an important logistical hub, highway, where you have Romanian and Bulgarian ports. You have the Danube, and you can kind of set these convoys and move a lot of stuff very quickly. And then they're about to take over Sevastopol, so you have Crimea to act as a base of operations to jump in. And so you can go. And this is the other idea, is back in the south, there's these big economic resources.
On the other side, Stalin is kind of trading space for time, right? To bring up reinforcements and to move his factories farther east and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But if you think like up north, like what if you attack in the north, that is like a resource, like import area, like it's like negligible, right? I mean, you have to bring in food to feed those places, even in Moscow. But down in the south, I mean, that's why you grab Ukraine, why you want to get Ukraine in the beginning, and then is because that's what the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and so you can grab even more of that breadbasket. Plus, you've got the oil fields in the south. Whereas up north, if you grab that territory, you've just kind of grabbed frozen or unfrozen taiga, like up in around like Leningrad. And Moscow is more of a target. So Hitler, if he's looking at like this longer war, he's looking now at the fact that he declared war on the United States. So you're facing kind of this big global war. So Hitler's idea is like, I have my allies in the south. We will kind of catch the Soviets flat-footed in the south. There's an expectation that you can destroy a lot of Soviet armies in encirclement battles again, and then you can grab these invaluable resources down in the Caucasus, especially oil, and deprive it from the Soviets, and also cut the Volga, which is an important logistical highway. And the kind of combination of these things, you kind of will exhaust what they think are the final Soviet reserves, do a damage to their economy, and that will kind of finally be the final body blow that will kind of cause a collapse in the Red Army. That's kind of like Hitler's view of, kind of pie in the sky, that if we just make one more big effort, that the Soviets really don't have that much left, and we can grab these really important economic resources, that even if we don't knock them out, that will allow us to fight this big global war, which is now against the Soviets and the British and the Americans.
Right. Yeah. The city of Stalingrad was strategically important because it controlled the Volga River, a major supply route for the Soviet industry and oil. But looking back on it now, I always wonder if the city had been named Nothinggrad or didn't have Stalin's name on it, like would Hitler have gone after it? Should they have just avoided this trap of a city?
Well, the thing is, it wasn't a trap at first. I mean, no one ever talks about this, but Stalino, now we know it as Donetsk, it was named after Stalin, but it fell, and there isn't some big oh well, this becomes the place where they're going to fight, and in part it's because of that initial part of the plan. They really do. The German army is still, even though Hitler's talking about grabbing these oil resources, the real idea is we want to destroy the Red Army's reserves. We want to destroy big amounts of Soviet fighting power. That's Clausewitzian. That's the way you destroy the enemy, is by destroying its field army, right? And so the problem is, when you launch Case Blue, as they call it, in July into southern Russia, they create these smaller, that are supposed to be more manageable kind of cauldrons, encirclements. And they do take a fair amount of Soviet prisoners, but at this point, the Red Army is not going to sit there and fight it out. They know that if they get encircled, they'll be destroyed. And there is a lot of retreating by a lot of soldiers who are just we're going to get out of here. And there are other cities that the Germans go and take on rivers, just like Stalingrad, but the Soviets decide not to fight there. They pull out, and part of this is by planning. Part of this is because Soviet soldiers are taken off. I mean, commanders are not willing to stay there. And so the Germans get really frustrated. They're looking to destroy the enemy, and the enemy won't fight. And so then they have to all right, we didn't destroy the enemy, but we're still going to launch an attack into the south to try to grab these oil fields. But we still have to go towards Stalingrad. Stalingrad's not even a main target. The wording of our orders are attack and reach the Volga around the area of Stalingrad, right? It is not even a major part. The main target is supposed to be down south. You're just supposed to get to the Volga to provide flank coverage for those forces going south. The thing is, what happens is the Soviets finally pull back far enough where they feel like they can make a stand, and the Germans say, hey, they're fighting here. And so you kind of have to stop, turn, and fight. And to a certain extent, the Germans want this, right? The enemy is finally not running away. This is where the enemy is. We're going to fight him here. And they have all the advantages still. I mean, we're going to talk about the city fighting. I mean, they still have the advantages, with combined arms and training and ability. And so you're going to try to fight it out at this point. And it's not just, that's the other thing, is we always focus on the city fighting, but there's fighting outside the city, along the banks of the river, along the steppe and stuff. So it's not just in the city. There's fighting going on. The Soviets are going to be trying to break through into the city from the steppe, or from the hills north and the steppe south. So there's fighting going on all over the place. So that's part of it. It doesn't look like a trap at first. It looks like an opportunity to finally pin down the Soviets. You're going to realize your mission of providing flank support. Plus, you can finally smash. You've destroyed some a little bit earlier, that when they crossed the Don River at Kalak. But this is another opportunity to bash on the Red Army. You're supposed to take this position, and then kind of the mythos and the name kind of then comes afterwards, or kind of as they're fighting, it gets spun up into this, it's about the fact that it's Stalingrad. But it's more about the fact that the Red Army finally had retreated far enough that it couldn't retreat any further, and had reserves, and was willing to finally fight.
Okay. Yeah, the German attacking force, the German Sixth Army, was commanded by General Friedrich Paulus. Can you tell us about the number of troops and equipment on each side that was brought to battle?
Well, this is always, kind of difficult to parse, because, armies are always kind of changing size over different times, especially when they're moving around like this. I mean, the German Sixth Army is fairly large. It's supposed to be kind of over 250, possibly 280,000 soldiers eventually. You also have the German Fourth Panzer Army. It's smaller, something like 40,000. troops, but it also gets a Romanian corps, the Romanian Sixth Corps, with another about 40,000 men that had been fighting from the start of Case Blue back in July. It's been kind of assigned to different armies, helping provide flank support. You have Romanian troops coming in to help cover the southern flank. You have this Romanian corps covering this line of lakes south of the city on the Kalmuk steppe. Later on, we're going to get, another Romanian army of 170,000 men. An Italian army is already on the front with right now with 235,000. A Hungarian army further up the river on the Don with 209,000, which is including 50,000 unarmed Jewish laborers. But in the overall, it's something like 1 million men, 1 million like Axis forces by November of 1942, spread out from the Kalmuk steppe up to the city, and then cutting over from the Volga to the Don. In comparison, you have the Stalin, you have 3 fronts. These are kind of the Soviet army group equivalent. Overall, every Soviet unit is kind of smaller divisions, smaller armies, smaller, fronts, army groups than what the Germans have or what the Americans later have. So there's 3 fronts, Stalingrad front, Don front, and Southwestern front, that are facing the Germans. And they will eventually get something like 1.2 million men. So you're going to see it's relatively comparable, in manpower. But the big difference is going to be in concentration of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, especially by late November of 1942.
Yeah, the Soviet defenses were directed by Generals Zhukov, Chuikov, among others, whose troops fight brutal urban combat inside the city. Was it a bend but don't break strategy? Because you always hear that famous, at one point the Germans controlled 90% of the city, but they still couldn't clinch the battle.
Yeah, so this is, in part, it's just the Soviet desire to stand and fight. Something we should mention is Stalin's infamous order earlier on in July. I think it's Order 227. Not one step back, right? So there's just this desire, which we're going to see that Hitler has later on, of just never surrendering territory. And there's that same impulse on the Soviet side, especially from Stalin. And the interesting thing about that order is, saying that, not one step back, is that, my advisor, Roger Rees, he's written a book on this. And, it's really, there's orders just like that, back in 41. There's been several orders like that, and threatening execution and even actual execution. There's been general executed for losing a battle in 1941. And what's actually interesting about the not one step back order is that it actually gives an out. It actually also sets up the idea of punishment or penal battalions, which means so there's actually an option not to shoot people. And even then, he'll point out, the amount of soldiers actually shot by the quote unquote blocking detachments is actually very little. Blocking detachments usually only had pistols and rifles. They were mostly there basically act as military police to police up people who'd kind of gotten lost or ran away and send them back to their units. If you didn't resist these guys, you weren't going to get shot by them. And then if maybe you got caught and you're determined to have been running away or cowardly, you get put into one of these penal battalions instead of being shot. And you serve for a little bit of time and then you get out. Yes, you have a higher risk of being killed while you're in it. So there's actually the change there is actually that you're not going to waste manpower by just shooting people. You're creating these penal battalions, which then you can still get use out of. And then once you serve your time, you go back to your units. But the point is that there is this idea of stand and fight. And so it's more the fact that you've retreated so far, and this time they're going to fight in this city. In other places, they either lost control of their men, or the Soviet commanders have decided, we can't make a stand here. But at this point, the Germans are getting much more overstretched. This is an important city. This is an important target. And, they decide we're going to fight. And you have a commander, Chuikov, who's willing to fight and use it. And again, on the flanks outside the city, there's fighting going on. At this point, it's not covered by, I'm not even talking yet about these allies, but once the Germans cut off the city to the north, there are constant Soviet counterattacks trying to break through down in the city. So it's not just, dead men don't break in the city. It's on you have these relief counterattacks to the north, and often sometimes to the south. You mean they almost break through that Romanian core, and the Germans have to stabilize that. There's just kind of push back and forth of the Germans having to reinforce the flanks, hold off the Soviets, which means slows down attacks into the city, and then you pull guys away from the flanks, push into the city more, and then the city, and so eventually you can start focusing on that. And then the Soviets kind of realize we're going to hold off on the flanks, start building up power, and let the Germans chew up their forces in the city until we're ready to have another big offensive on the flanks. And by this point, they're also thinking we're going to not just attack where the Germans are on the flanks, we're going to attack a little bit farther, which is both two things. You get to attack Romanians on the flanks, who are a lot weaker, and you're going for a bigger encirclement. Like instead, if you're attacking right north of the city, you might break through, you're not really going to encircle any German troops. You go farther, you're going to take bigger risk of this not working. But if you do this right, you're going to have a big double encirclement that's going to grab a lot of German forces, and you have the added benefit of, hey, we're going against weak Romanians on the flanks rather than German troops.
Right. Yeah, let's get into the micro level for a second. The battle becomes infamous for house-to-house fighting with soldiers battling in factories, apartments, and even sewers. Can you tell us about some of the famous fights and fighters, like the sniper Vasily Zaitsev, Sergeant Pavlov and his defiant stand at the house? And even I read that the worst mistake the Germans did was like bomb the city because it gave all these snipers places to hide. So it was like just a brutal slogging fest on the ground level.
Yeah, I mean, fighting in cities is not what really anyone trains for, especially at that point. But you train to kind of go, fight out in this kind of abstract, kind of almost Napoleonic, like out in the field. And I think there was a lot less focus on city fighting in general for these armies. So, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of mistakes there about bombing the city, you're creating rubble. But you also have to bomb the city if you want to. If you want to take it, you have to bomb the enemy. So it's kind of, it's like I don't know how you don't bomb the city. So it's just, and you have this. I think there's still been arguments that the Germans are still better prepared, better trained for this. It's not like the Soviets just have better training, but I think it's also the idea of like attacking versus defense, right? I mean, this is one of the areas where the defense is going to have the advantage. You can dig in, you can set up ambushes, you're going to know the territory. But the Germans really, they have a lot of, powerful advantages, but they're going to be negated just because of what the city is. And I think it's important, like the city, it's long and narrow along the river, which makes it, you have to spread out your forces, right? But it also means that you can maybe kind of cut through the city more easily in certain areas, which the Germans can do. But that means that you have to capture some of these key points, which is why you have some of these things like the grain elevator, which I think is a big, large, tall, resilient, structure made out of like reinforced concrete, right? That overlooks everything. So the Germans can kind of start coming in, but then every time it's like I said, you eventually have to concentrate. And if you have some observers up in this big grain elevator, Soviets can see that and they can bring down fire. And they have the advantage that they can put a lot of their artillery on the opposite side of the river where it's fairly, protected. So you have these crazy battles over the grain elevator. This is one I think this is back in the south of the city. We talked about Pavlov's house. This is like a smaller place. It's up in kind of I think the middle of the city. Once you get into from like the suburbs, this is one building that was more or less intact and more resilient and bigger, and once again gave good observation, right? There's kind of an argument now whether Sergeant Pavlov had to fight for the house or if it was empty and he took it, and whether or not that was true when he initially retook it, from the German lines, it definitely became fought over very intensively. Ian McGregor has written a book about this. If someone really wants to, get into, called The Lighthouse of Stalingrad. Zaitsev is really interesting. Everyone knows kind of the movie Enemy at the Gates now. I think it would be interesting to kind of do a bit more of a realistic version. Zaitsev, he starts as a clerk in the Soviet Navy in the Far East at the start of the war, which kind of something is kind of fun, like that he's just kind of a paper pusher out in Vladivostok and volunteers to go fight in the front. He's really famous for inventing new tactics and stuff.
But they had female snipers as well. Like everyone was pitching in.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting the female snipers that they develop over time. I mean, at first, like when some of the women are volunteering, they're kind of doing for all different things. With the Soviets, set up these female sniper teams. I think in part because of that keeps them from they're able to fight on the front and support a unit, but without how they would see is disrupting small unit cohesion. Because sniper teams operate kind of on their own basically.
Yeah.
So if you attach a couple women as snipers to an infantry company, the infantry company can basically fight normally, and then you don't have these issues of like, men getting weirded out by having women, fighting with them. So Zaitsev, he does this thing called sixes. You cover an area with 3 2-man teams. So there's no real like sniper duel as you see in the movie. It was just at Stalingrad, and there was lots of sniping there in general.
Yeah, it is impressive. It was a big win for the Soviets, so I understand the propaganda that comes out of it.
I will put one more. So there's also like the Barakarty factory, the Martinesky shop. These are like, as you get in closer to the city, there's these big industrial areas that they're reinforced and they're difficult to take, and they become these centers of resistance. And I will mention the Army University Press. They created they have a documentary series, and they have on YouTube. If you really want to get in detail, they will go like kind of have hour-long explorations of each of the battles for these different factories and shops and the grain elevator, which I recommend.
Yeah. If you want to drill down, check that out. But yeah, if we zoom back out to the flanks of Stalingrad, tell me about the operation, what it was called, and how the trap was closed where Paulus was now stuck in Stalingrad.
After August, getting into September, as it's clear that the Germans aren't just going to seize the city, that you have a commander in place Chuikov, who's got a big set of balls, who has men who aren't going to run, like as in some other places, and that the Soviets realize that they're able to reinforce them. They see this opportunity, like, hey, maybe we can build up some reserves here. If like Chuikov and the Stalingrad front can, these guys can really keep them, distracted, we can build up these, a counteroffensive. Like I said, this big, double envelopment. It becomes called Operation Uranus, and they're also planning another one, Operation Mars, farther up, and they also have another one called Saturn. There's this idea of these kind of big, these are the gods of war. Mars, Uranus, Saturn. You're going to have these massive winter counteroffensive, starting off against this exposed German flank here at Stalingrad. And there's an argument now that they're also even like specifically waiting for bad weather to negate the German advantage in air power. So that, there's some argument there. Whether or not that's true, when they do launch this finally, it is going to be terrible weather. So that German combined arms is going to be one of that triad is going to be gone. Plus, like I said, you're going to be focusing on the Romanian Third Army and then this Romanian Sixth Corps, which actually gets reinforced with another corps that's showing up. So this is supposed to be good. South, you're getting another corps. They're actually going to be setting up the Romanian Fourth Army headquarters. But they have these bridgeheads over the river that they can fill up with troops. They've also been attriting the Romanians over this time, especially on the Don. The Romanian Third Army has been having to expend munitions and manpower and basically keep almost all of its divisions online. It only has a couple, like 1 or 2 divisions in reserve. So that means you have a very thin, long front that's going to be easy to crack. And these units don't have as much firepower, as many anti-tank guns. I even found reports in the Romanian records of later a captured Soviet soldier saying that they'd been shown captured Romanian guns during some of these earlier battles in September, October, and the Soviets had used these Romanian captured guns and fired them at Soviet or tanks, and showing the soldiers how the rounds were just ricocheting off. And saying, look, this is all that the Romanians have. You guys can just drive forward and not have to worry.
Right.
So there's this kind of whole psychological element too of like, we're attacking the Romanians. If you're Soviet, you maybe have this kind of inferiority complex against the Germans. It doesn't really exist with the Romanians, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Like, or even the Italians, like they're just not as well equipped as the Germans are, so we can beat these guys.
Right. Yeah, and it's just so then they're just less in your head as well, right? So it's kind of all those things where it's that they're putting together, and so they finally launched this 19 November. And first they launch it in the northern sector on the Don, and the Romanians actually put up more of a fight than they expect. They expect the Romanian line just to like collapse, but they only managed to punch 2 holes, and it actually has the group in the middle, which is like about 3 divisions worth, plus the remnants of a couple other divisions, keep fighting for another like almost 4 or 5 days, called the Lascar group. But the Soviets at this point say, screw it, just throw in the reserves, just keep punching through. And the Germans, they don't have anything to respond. They have one Panzer Corps in reserve, which is actually half Romanian. They don't coordinate well. They're basically immediately, they basically are having to fight off Soviet patrols. They can't go fill in one of these 2 holes. They actually like try to go for one of the holes, one of the breakthrough points, and then they redirect themselves to the other one. So they waste time going one way, and then they go the other way, and then they just like have to start and try to save themselves from being overwhelmed. And so then the next day you have the southern flank, and in that case the Romanian line does just basically like disintegrate. But that's because it's a much weaker line, and you basically have an entire like Soviet army against like one Romanian corps. I mean, there's these Germans who are watching. It's just like, what are these guys going to do? So they just get steamrolled. It kind of just explodes. But even there's the Romanian cavalry troops farther south that had newly arrived. They had come up from Crimea. They had pretty good morale. They, kind of are trying to fight and hold the line. And they are going to be really important to holding a line, both the remnants of both of these Romanian 3rd and 4th armies, to give the Germans a chance to actually try to relieve Stalingrad. But at this point, you have these 2 big pinchers that are going to encircle the German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army in this pocket.
Yeah. Operation Uranus encircles over 250,000 Axis troops, essentially trapping the German 6th Army inside Stalingrad. So what are General Paulus's options now?
Yeah, it's even actually possibly like up to 300,000 troops. When you throw in the Romanian, there's like a couple remnants of Romanian Cavalry Corps and infantry division that get sucked up in there. There's also a Croatian regiment. And so Paulus's options, right? I mean, like, there's this big thing like, oh, he should have immediately, ordered a breakout. Well, that's against orders. An interesting thing, I think this Lascar group that I brought up is an interesting example of what's facing a case study of maybe what would have happened. So all these forces, the Romanian 3rd Army, the German 6th Army, they have sent home a lot of their horses, or sent to wintering quarters a lot of their horses. They've been having a supply crisis before the Soviet attack. So they actually are low on horses. They're also low on gasoline because of the supply. So the mobility of any of these forces is pretty low, right? And if you want to try to break out immediately, number one, you have to leave some guys to keep fighting, right? Like, you're not going to be able to take them all. You're going to have to sacrifice a quarter or half of your men.
You have to have a rear guard. Yeah.
And then you're going to have to, so if you try to break out and you don't have much fuel, in reality, like, we think about fighting like cross country, but that's not your option. You have to go along roads. But the problem is the Soviets control those roads. That's where they're going to have most of their troops. So then you do have to go cross country. But what happens when you go cross country? Your horses slip, your guns get stuck in mud or water, your tank throws a track. And if you look at what happens to the Lascar group, it's told, you're going to stay and fight, and you're going to fight until we come and relieve you. After a couple of days, it's pretty clear that the German and Romanian armored forces aren't coming to the rescue. So they actually take the initiative against orders from both German High Command and Romanian High Command, who said, you're supposed to stay and fight. They decide to try to have a breakout attempt. One division kind of gets it going. The other ones they're being engaged. And they actually eventually get overrun, and you lose a couple commanders. But so you have this one division plus remnants of other ones try to break out. And it's, at first, in the middle of the night, you have these long nights right now, right? It's bad weather, but they have to avoid these roads. They start going cross country. And eventually the Soviets figure out what's happening. You have this long line of men who are strung out, and they start attacking it, right? Cutting it up. And then the Romanians who are keeping on going, they then come to like a river valley, and they can't get their heavy weapons, through. We're not, they're having to leave behind guns, they're having to leave behind broken down cars or like wagons, and they eventually, something like a couple thousand soldiers, they make it through the breakthrough, and that's it out of like a division's worth. And then even fewer of them survive because they link up with they link up with the German Panzer Division, but then the German Panzer Division gets attacked, and so then they have to retreat again. You only have a few hundred of these guys like make it out. So if you imagine, that's on the scale of like the small division size, multi-division breakout. You take that to an army and think of like the ramifications. So that's really a kind of a terrible option.
Yeah, and if you listen to our Von Menstein episode, he gets, I think, within 30 miles of Stalingrad as a relief column, but he just can't break through. So I think this next part's really interesting. They can still communicate, obviously, with Berlin. So Paulus says, hey, can you resupply me somehow? And here's what they need to actually fight normally. And when I say tons of supplies, I mean bullets, replacement parts, winter clothing, food, fuel, all that stuff. They normally need 750 tons a day. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe commander, says they can deliver 500 tons a day. 300 tons is the absolute minimum just to keep the army alive. And what actually ends up getting delivered is only 100 tons a day.
Mm-hmm.
Why did Hitler, was he just grasping at straws? Why did he think Göring could pull this off?
That's really probably what it was. Like I said, if you try to break out immediately, you're disobeying orders, and you're likely you're gonna lose most of your force. You have to leave behind rear guard. You're gonna be exposed out there. If you sit tight and await relief, that's kind of the best option. And especially if like someone says, "Hey, we can drop supplies," this has been done. I mean, there's been I can't remember what the battle is, but there was a smaller army, German force was encircled. They were able to drop some supplies, and eventually it was able to break out. Right? They've done this on a smaller scale before. So like proof of concept, right? And I mean, it's like the Germans have kind of, even it's interesting, like even that German armored Panzer division I was talking about that's roaming around behind the Don, it's having supplies dropped to it. Like they're doing this like to keep it going, and like the Romanian armored division is actually screaming like we need it too, and the Germans won't give them any because they're running out of fuel. So like they're doing this on a smaller scale, and like in the past they've had enough combat power to like kind of come back. Like this is a big force, right? Like so sitting tight and await relief, especially when you have this promise of air support, is not that crazy. And then you could surrender, right? That's the other thing, is you just surrender it immediately, and that'd be a terrible like idea, right? And eventually, as Manstein gets building up, like the focus becomes on like you can't surrender, because first I got to try to launch this relief attack, and once that fails because there's a bigger Soviet storm, another big offensive, Little Saturn, which we'll talk about in a minute, coming, then it's like, hey, you must keep fighting, because if you don't keep fighting, you're not tying down all these Soviet forces. Instead, they'll be turning and attacking the German forces elsewhere. So, the idea that like Paulus is weak, he should have disobeyed Hitler. I mean, if you're looking at what their experience is and what the reality is, sitting tight and awaiting relief is kind of the best option. And then once you've done that long enough, then you've got to fight it to the very bitter end to hold down the enemy, to save our heinies elsewhere.
Right. And it must be said, this is the dead of winter. This is December, January, February. So German soldiers start suffering from starvation, frostbite, ammunition shortages. How terrible was the suffering on both sides?
It's pretty bad. I mean, even for the Soviets going into this, I mean, their logistics are on a shoestring. The propaganda reels will show Soviet soldiers well kitted out to fall with their little hats and fake fur hats. Actually, they call them like fish fur, because they'd never seen an animal that actually had that type of fur. But like they were also like cold and low on food and everything. But the German side was much, much worse. Once you get encircled, you're like you pointed out, 100 tons rather than the 700. I mean, it starts getting bad really quickly. You have horses you can slaughter, and there's in the Romanian 1st Cavalry Division, a lot of it had ridden up into the encirclement, and those horses are very soon in the cooking pots of the encircled forces. It's really bad. And you have to also, like I said, there was already a supply shortage. A lot of these guys are already very lean going into this, kind of undernourished. They might not have been realizing it. And so there's soldiers just dropping dead because of kind of their hearts are giving out. And then once and this is like even before the encirclement, you're having these problems. And then once you have the encirclement, it just becomes an insane kind of almost laboratory of what you can put the human body through and how people can die from starvation. And they'll, they often won't call it starvation. It'll be like, a cardiac event, but it'd be because they're so thin.
Yeah.
And, lacking fat and under so much stress. These soldiers are, and it's interesting. I read this Romanian account, and he's like, they will, once you get that cold, you stop moving as you try to conserve energy, and you just like try to not move. They're burning tires. They're worn out tires that they have, and so you're like in these rooms, you're setting this stuff, and it's like that nasty kind of oily, petroleum smoke, and you would just try to move as little as possible. And, then you'd have to go out and fight periodically. Or for the Romanians, they actually would beat up the guys if they wouldn't go fight. They were going to be that kind of aggressive to the troops.
Well, Paulus and the remaining German forces eventually surrender on February 2nd, 1943. Why did Hitler promote Paulus to Field Marshal right before this? And did any of these surrendering troops return home after the war?
So there was this belief that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, gone into captivity. So basically there was this hope that Paulus would commit suicide. There's kind of a general, even the Romanians, they would talk about that same guy, that same account I was reading, he would talk about the Glonsdale and Wade, the honor bullet. So they're kind of discussing, like, do we kill ourselves rather than like be captured?
Who's to say Paulus's next in command wouldn't then surrender, even if Paulus did do this? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's strange, but dictators, they kind of like to be jerks. Paulus was also Catholic. People point this out, like he's not somebody who really, that's like, that's a sin, right, to kill yourself. So there's this idea to try to, have him die that way. This is the kind of Nazi worldview, right? That if you, either you go out, you have to go out fighting, or you. It's great, and like that, even that Romanian, nobody actually really does it. No one actually follows through, and in the end, you want to go into captivity.
Yeah. Which Hitler does on his own a few years later.
Hitler, at least Hitler kills himself, I guess. Of those who can, very few of these guys return. And for, they are in terrible shape by the time they're captured. Even if they were given the best treatment in the world, a lot of them would have died. But the Soviets don't have ability to. They are very short. This is a bad time in the war for them. They've cut back everything on the home front that they possibly can. And so they're not going to be prioritizing feeding prisoners of war, and you prioritize feeding prisoners of war who can work. And that's going to be really bad, and the Soviets really haven't, they don't tend to take preventive measures. They haven't already built, nice prisoner of war camps. The Americans, when we captured a bunch of prisoners of war, we'd usually build a camp first, where the Soviets were kind of like that. These prisoners of war would show up and there was a camp for them to build. And so very few of these guys make it through that first winter just because of the bad shape they're in, the shortages in the Soviet Union. It's not really a purposeful policy to kill them.
Right.
Even the Romanians are suffering. They won't die in quite as heavy a number. And the Romanians who weren't encircled, they have a better chance. But they also die in kind of higher percentages because, they surrender after. There's big chunk of 20,000 that surrender in the Lascar group early on, just days in the battle, and they still, but it's just because the conditions are so bad. You have this Operation Little Saturn, that's the reason why you can't have this relief work, right? That if a month later, the Soviets not only launch Operation Uranus, they're able to launch, they have to scale it down. That's why it's called Little Saturn instead of Saturn. It was supposed to be really big. They launch another big offensive, and it smashes the Italian 8th Army that was to the left of the Romanian 3rd Army. And then a month later, they smash the Hungarian Second Army. They don't encircle them; they break them, and those armies start running. Which then the Germans have to then call off the relief. Manstein then has to turn into like super crisis mode and let's get everyone out. Let's get these guys out of the Caucasus. So the Italian and Hungarians have a bit of a different experience. Like the Romanians had helped. Some of them had got caught in Stalingrad. Some of them had surrendered early on. The remnants helped try this relief offensive. Then eventually the Romanians kind of get pulled off in January, February. That's when the Italians and Hungarians get hit, and they basically they have to do these kind of long marches. Like the guys who survive the initial battle, they turn into these big roving pockets, and it's kind of these terrible long marches through the cold, through the winter, as they're steadily throwing away, equipment to try to keep going, and they're getting harassed by the enemy. They're getting bombed, but it's this kind of like long march in the cold. So there's these different experiences where you're like, whether you're talking about the encircled in Stalingrad or the Romanians outside in the flanks who get bashed up, or these long marches of the Hungarians and Italians. Like it's just all kinds of different ugliness and terrible ways of dying.
Okay. The Battle of Stalingrad was a major turning point in World War II, marking the beginning of the long Soviet offensive that would eventually end in the Battle of Berlin in 1945. What were the casualty estimates on both sides?
Well, once again, this is difficult. I mean, it all depends on like periodization, right? Are we talking about just Stalingrad? Are we talking about just Operation Uranus? Are we talking about Uranus and Little Saturn? Are we talking about are we talking about the whole campaign from July? And kind of like looking at like the whole campaign. The Germans lose something like 200,000 troops, killed, captured, missing, sick, everything, right?
Yeah.
Then after, when we're counting from like November, once like the big Soviet counteroffensives start, then the Germans lose another like 300,000. The Romanians lose like 109,000. The Italians 114,000. Hungarians 105,000 from like November to February. So, and then you have to throw the Axis allies. You have to add in like another like thousands more that they lost in that August to November period, especially the Romanians. Then the Soviets, they lose something like 1.2 million between August and November. So before they even start winning, they've taken a lot of casualties. And then even during the victory, they lose something like 425,000 troops. I mean, so that's like when you're winning, you're still taking hundreds of thousands of casualties. The ones who got killed, wounded, missing, sick. Really importantly is also to emphasize the huge material losses to the Axis, right? Something like enough equipment and weapons for 45 German divisions are lost from the start of Case Blue to the fall of Stalingrad. And that stuff is just, you can't just replace that with the snap of the fingers.
Right. So my final question is, what is the legacy of Stalingrad? I guess it depends on your nationality. If you're Russian or Soviet, it's probably a huge legacy. We finally stopped these guys. But overall, what do you think the legacy is?
So immediate ones, I think like it shattered kind of the last hopes of the Axis. This idea of maybe it's not the actual turning point. There's always arguments about what the turning point of the war or the Eastern Front specifically. But I think it's very clear this was an important battle and especially spun as a turning point in the propaganda. And that is important, not at the time, right? To be able to say, hey, we won, right? So like that really has immediate legacy right there during the war, right? The propaganda coming out of it, there's the material effect. I think if we're kind of looking longer, like Stalingrad becomes like essential to the legitimizing myth of the Great Patriotic War, which underpins Soviet regime up until its collapse. So there's a great book by Jonathan Brunstadt that talks about this, like fighting this war, and like Stalingrad's got the center of it. This like legitimizes the Soviet power for the next like 40 years.
I wonder if you ask each country, like I'm sure Britain would say, no, it was El Alamein, or the U.S. would say it was Midway, or the Russians would say it was Stalingrad. I think it just depends on your perspective.
Yeah, but I think Stalingrad has, I think even like the most patriotic Brit would have said also Stalingrad. If you look at like the propaganda and you have like, there was a lot of support for the Red Army, and like I think people understood how big it was. I think maybe today they would do that, but I think we all know Stalingrad, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's kind of a global event there in that sense, because I think it's like a global spanning thing. And then you have all these countries involved, like, kind of just mentioned, it becomes in Romania and Hungary, the battle becomes used by the new communist regimes to discredit the previous regime, capitalist, fascist regimes. And then in Italy, it's defended. There's tons of movies in Italy about the Eastern Front in general, and all those countries that have participated. It's really important. It really shapes their memories of the war. But the battle itself, I think, is still a global one that like anybody can kind of know about. I mean, somebody from outside of Europe, will have heard of Stalingrad where they would have not have heard of a lot of other battles.
Yeah, it's interesting how you mentioned it was almost like Napoleon's Napoleonic Battle of Leipzig, which was the Battle of Nations. In your mind, you're thinking, all right, well, Stalingrad was just Germans versus Soviets, but it wasn't. It was, like you said, it was Bulgarians and Croats and Romanians and Italians. There was a lot of different nationalities battling there.
The Soviet side, I mean, part of that Pavlov's house myth was that they focused on that allegedly there was a representative of all the Soviet nations, so that you had, Central Asians, and even on the Soviet side for a long time, it's not just a battle between Russians, great Russians, so versus Germans. It was the entirety of the Soviet nationalities, Uzbeks to Caucasians to Ingush to Belarusians. So and so even today, if you go to the Central Asian republics, right, which are now like independent, they will have their memories of the Battle of Stalingrad. And right now, the Battle of Stalingrad is being used by both sides, right? In Ukraine, the Ukrainians are using it and the Russians are using it. There is a global stretch to this battle that's, I think, has a huge legacy.
Yeah. Even the name, it's almost become like linguistic, or like I did an episode on General Slim and he defeated the Japanese at Kohima, and it became kind of the Stalingrad of the East because the British finally defeated the Japanese. But the name Stalingrad is now used in that vernacular.
Right. The same thing, Tunisgrad, right? They dubbed the fall of Tunis, but it's Tunisgrad, right? Which is basically saying it's the Stalingrad of North Africa. So this idea of Stalin, I mean, and so if, I mentioned the Army University Press's documentary team's Stalingrad series of videos, that's also part of a Stalingrad virtual staff ride that was put together by the Army University Press. And I know from talking to some people there that basically that was chosen by one of the generals, like, we need to focus on different things, including like city combat. So Stalingrad, right? It was like today, let's make this big virtual, let's invest all this money, create this virtual staff ride to talk about city fighting, about Stalingrad, even though you could look at, we just got out of Iraq. There's a lot of city fighting in Iraq that we could have learned from, but the first thing we talk about is Stalingrad. So there's this resonance to it, and this idea of like street fighting, oh, that's Stalingrad, right? And then if we've I tried to expand it to like remember there's stuff going on the flanks, but that battle is just so memorable. And there's a great book by Ian Gardner called Stalingrad Lives, I think it's Stalingrad Lives, but I read it sometimes as Stalingrad Lives. It kind of works that way, where there's a lot of different stories, but it's a very good book if you want to look at like how the mythos was like kind of created as it was written by the Soviet reporters at the time. And as the battle was going, they were kind of setting it up to become this pivotal mythic turning point. Whether it's an actual turning point, it really was an important battle, which now is seen as that by so many people for so many years. I think it will continue to be seen that way and attract tons of attention and fascination and horror, for decades to come.
Well, thank you for that, Grant. That was fantastic. Again, Grant's book is called Romania's Holy War, which you can find on Amazon. And I also recommend, if you like our podcast, please give us a follow over on X, Twitter, and on Facebook. And of course, rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Grant, we thank you for your time, sir.
Well, thank you for having me on.